The wind, a bitter courier from the endless plains, whipped Ilara's thin shawl tight against her swollen belly, stealing the breath from her lungs and dusting her chapped lips with grit. Each gust seemed to carry the fading condemnation of Elder Miller, his voice, righteous and unyielding, still echoing in the hollows of her memory, an abomination, a weight we cannot carry, a sin we will not harbor. The last wagon, a receding speck of canvas and wood, had finally vanished over the undulating horizon, taking with it the flimsy illusion of community, of safety. Around her, the prairie stretched, vast and indifferent, its grasses sighing like 1,000 mournful voices. Her meager bundle of possessions, a threadbare blanket, a small tin of hoarded biscuits, a wooden cup, and the clothes she wore lay at her feet, cast from the wagon with the same casual disdain as refuse. She was alone, a solitary, pregnant woman left to the mercy of a wilderness that knew none. The sky, a canvas of bruised purples and angry greys, mirrored the turmoil in her heart. A storm was coming, she could smell it in the air, taste its metallic tang, feel its oppressive weight pressing down. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness that had momentarily cocooned her. The baby shifted within, a flutter of innocent life oblivious to the precipice upon which they stood. It was for this child, this unborn soul, that a primal fear, stark and terrifying, now clawed its way up her throat, choking back the sobs that threatened to overwhelm her. She pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, a protective gesture against a world suddenly rendered hostile and unforgiving. The accusations, the whispered judgments, the averted gazes of those she had once called neighbors, they swirled in her mind, each memory a fresh lash. Her husband, Thomas, lost to the fever 3 weeks past, could not defend her name, could not shield her from their pious cruelty. They had called her a burden, a bringer of ill fortune. His death, they implied, was a sign. And so, under the guise of communal preservation, they had excised her, the offending part, to lighten their load, to purify their journey. The irony was a bitter ash in her mouth. This land, this supposed haven of new beginnings, had already shown its capacity for savage endings. The sun dipped lower, painting the undersides of the storm clouds in hues of blood orange and sickly yellow. The air grew colder, the silence more profound, broken only by the ceaseless moan of the wind through the tall grass and the frantic thumping of her own heart. She sank to her knees, the rough earth scraping her skin, the weight of her belly pulling her downward. There was no trail to follow, no landmark to guide, only the crushing immensity of the plains and the looming threat of the night. The scent of rain grew stronger, carried on an increasingly agitated wind that tugged at her hair, whipping loose strands across her face, stinging her eyes already blurred with unshed tears. The horizon was a darkening line, a final, disappearing seam between the known and the terrifyingly unknown. She was a ship cut adrift, rudderless, at the mercy of an indifferent ocean of grass. The final, faint creak of wagon wheels, long imagined perhaps, had now truly faded, replaced by the rising symphony of the approaching storm. Ilara drew her shawl tighter, a pitiful defense against the biting wind that seemed to penetrate to her very bones. Each breath was a struggle, the air thick with dust and the heavy, metallic scent of rain. The world had shrunk to this small patch of unforgiving earth, the vastness around her serving only to amplify her profound isolation. She tried to stand, her legs stiff and trembling, her body protesting with a dull ache that resonated deep within her pelvis. The baby, once a comforting presence, now felt like an anchor, tying her to this desolate spot. What would they eat? Where would they shelter? The questions hammered at her, each one a blow against her dwindling resolve. The biscuits in her tin were few, a couple of days' sustenance at best. Water, a more immediate concern, was nowhere in sight. She scanned the landscape, a desperate hope flickering. Perhaps a creek, a small dip in the land that might hold moisture? But the prairie offered no such comfort, only an unending sameness, a deceptive flatness that hid countless small dangers. A distant howl, thin and mournful, cut through the wind's lament. Wolves. Her blood ran cold. She had heard stories around the campfires, tales of lone travelers and livestock taken by the packs that roamed these lands. She was defenseless, her only weapon the small, dull knife she used for preparing food, still tucked into her bundle. It would be useless against such predators. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against her face, cold and unwelcome. The storm was breaking. Panic, a wild, unreasoning thing, threatened to consume her. She had to move, to find some semblance of shelter, however meager. A rock outcropping, a dense thicket of bushes, anything to break the force of the wind and rain. But in which direction? The sky offered no clues, now a solid sheet of roiling grey. She felt a flicker of movement at the very edge of her peripheral vision, a shadow amongst shadows. Her head snapped up, heart leaping into her throat. Was it an animal? Or perhaps, a far more terrifying thought, one of the wagon train men, returned for some cruel amusement or darker purpose. She strained her eyes, but saw nothing. The wind playing tricks, her fear conjuring phantoms from the swaying grasses. She told herself this, but the unease remained, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. The rain intensified, quickly soaking through her shawl and dress, plastering her hair to her scalp. Shivering violently, she picked up her small bundle, its weight almost unbearable. Each step was an effort, her sodden skirts clinging to her legs, the mud sucking at her worn shoes. She stumbled, catching herself with a cry of pain as her ankle twisted. Tears, hot and frustrated, finally broke free, mingling with the cold rain on her cheeks. It was too much. The abandonment, the fear, the storm, the gnawing hunger, the terrifying loneliness. She was not strong enough for this. Not alone. A small, sheltered depression in the earth, barely a hollow, offered a sliver of respite from the direct assault of the wind. She huddled there, pulling her knees to her chest as much as her pregnant belly would allow, trying to shield her bundle from the worst of the downpour. The light was fading fast, the world dissolving into a monochrome landscape of grey and black. The cold was seeping into her, a dangerous lethargy beginning to creep over her senses. She thought of Thomas, his gentle smile, the warmth of his hand in hers. If only he were here. But he was gone, and with him, all her hope. The darkness was almost complete now, the storm a raging entity all around her. The storm raged through the night, a relentless assault of wind and water. Elara drifted in and out of a fitful, chilled sleep, curled as tightly as she could in the shallow depression, her blanket offering scant protection against the drenching rain and penetrating cold. Each clap of thunder sounded like the crack of doom, each flash of lightning illuminated a world made alien and hostile. When dawn finally broke, it was to a landscape washed clean but utterly desolate. The sky was a pale, exhausted grey, the wind still sighing, though its fury had abated. She was stiff, soaked to the bone, and a deep, aching hunger gnawed at her stomach. The immediate threat of the storm had passed, but her predicament remained unchanged, perhaps even worsened. She pushed herself up, wincing as her muscles protested. Her ankle throbbed painfully. As she tried to stand, a wave of dizziness swept over her, and she sank back down, gasping. It was then, in the grey morning light, that she saw him. He stood not 20 paces away, as still and silent as the ancient stones scattered across the prairie. A native man, tall and lean, clad in deerskins that blended seamlessly with the muted colors of the land. His black hair, long and straight, was held back by a simple leather band. A quiver of arrows was slung across his back, a bow held loosely in one hand. His face, weathered and stern, was unreadable. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a fresh wave of terror washing over her. She had heard horrific tales of savages, of brutal attacks on isolated settlers. Was this her end then? To survive the judgment of her own kind only to fall prey to another? He made no move, his dark eyes fixed on her. There was no overt menace in his gaze, but an unnerving intensity, a watchfulness that seemed to see right through her. She remained frozen, too terrified to speak, to move, even to breathe. The silence stretched, broken only by the drip of water from the sodden grass and the distant cry of a hawk. He took a slow, deliberate step towards her, and she flinched, instinctively trying to press herself further into the damp earth. He stopped, his expression unchanging. Then, with a fluid movement, he reached into a pouch at his waist and drew out something dark and flat, a piece of dried meat. He held it out, not advancing further, just offering. Elara stared at the jerky, then back at his impassive face. Was it a trick? A means to lure her closer? Hunger warred with fear. The smell of the smoked meat, faint as it was, reached her, making her stomach clench with a painful spasm. Her own biscuits were likely a sodden mush. He said nothing, his arm remaining extended. The silence was a heavy weight. She looked at his eyes again, searching for any sign of deceit, of cruelty. She saw only a deep, almost unnerving calm. He was a hunter, that much was clear, a man of this wilderness. He did not look like the caricatures from the fearful stories, not a painted, yelling warrior, but something far more elemental, more connected to the earth itself. Desperation began to edge out the terror. She was already dying out here. What more could she lose? Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers brushed his as she took the jerky, his skin surprisingly warm against her cold flesh. He withdrew his hand without a word. He then gestured with his chin towards a low rise in the land, a barely perceptible fold in the prairie that she hadn't noticed before. He grunted, a single, guttural sound, then turned and began to walk in that direction, not looking back to see if she followed. Ilara watched him go, the jerky clutched in her hand. Her mind raced. To follow a stranger, an Indian, into the unknown? Or to remain here, alone, weak, and exposed? The choice was stark, yet in its own way, simple. Remaining here was a slow death sentence. He, at least, seemed to offer the possibility of survival, however slim, however frightening. With a surge of desperate resolve, fueled by the small piece of nourishment and the faintest glimmer of hope, Ilara pushed herself to her feet, biting back a cry as pain shot through her ankle. She took a deep breath, the cool, damp air filling her lungs, and began to limp after the retreating figure, a tiny, bedraggled woman trailing a silent, enigmatic guide into the heart of the wilderness. The hunter, whom she would later learn was named Mawa, moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long familiarity with the terrain. He did not hurry, yet his pace was steady, and Ilara struggled to keep up, her injured ankle protesting with every uneven step. He led her over the rise and down into a shallow, sheltered draw, invisible from the open prairie. Here, nestled beneath a protective overhang of rock, was a small, dry cave, little more than a deep recess, but a haven compared to the exposed hollow where she had spent the night. A faint, smoky scent clung to the air within. Mawa gestured towards the cave entrance with his bow, a silent invitation, then turned his attention to a small, carefully constructed fire pit just outside, where the remnants of a previous fire lay. He knelt, adding a few dry twigs from a bundle tucked under the overhang, and with a skill that seemed almost magical to Ilara, coaxed a flame to life using a fire drill. He did all this without looking at her, his movements precise and unhurried. Ilara hesitated at the mouth of the cave. It was dark within, and the unknown was still a potent fear. But the warmth beginning to emanate from the nascent fire was an irresistible lure. She took a tentative step inside. The cave was small, but deep enough to offer shelter. The floor was bare rock, cold but dry. She sank down near the entrance, her back against the cool stone, watching Mawa. He seemed oblivious to her presence, his focus entirely on his tasks. He added larger pieces of wood to the fire, then took a small pot from his own meager pack, a simple clay vessel, and, after retrieving a water skin, began to heat some water. The silence between them was thick, yet not entirely uncomfortable. It was the silence of the wild, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of the prairie. Ilara gnawed slowly on the piece of jerky he had given her. It was tough and salty, but it was food, and it sent a welcome warmth spreading through her empty stomach. She observed Mawa. He was not a young man, perhaps nearing 40 winters, she guessed, though it was hard to tell. His face was lined, not with age, but with experience, with exposure to sun and wind. There was a profound stillness about him, a sense of being utterly at home in this harsh environment. He was not what she had been taught to expect. There was no savagery in his demeanor, only a quiet competence, a self-sufficiency that was almost humbling. Her fear of him began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity, and a dawning, reluctant gratitude. He had not harmed her. He had offered food and shelter. Why? This question echoed in her mind. Was it pity? Or some other motive she couldn't fathom? After a time, he retrieved a few dried herbs from his pouch and added them to the now steaming water in the pot. The aroma that rose was faintly medicinal, earthy. He poured some of the brew into a small wooden cup, his own, and then, to her surprise, gestured for her own cup, which she shakily retrieved from her bundle. He poured some of the warm liquid into it and pushed it gently towards her across the dusty ground. She looked at the dark tea, then at him. His expression remained impassive. She brought the cup to her lips and sipped. It was bitter, but warm, and strangely comforting. It eased the chill that had settled deep in her bones. He drank his own tea in silence, his gaze directed towards the fire. He did not try to speak to her, nor did he make any demands. He simply existed, a quiet, watchful presence. As the day wore on, he left the cave, disappearing silently back onto the prairie. Ilara felt a pang of anxiety at his departure. What if he didn't return? But a part of her, a newly awakened instinct, trusted that he would. She spent the hours tending to her ankle, which was swollen and bruised, and trying to dry her damp clothes by the small, carefully banked fire. The cave, though primitive, offered a profound sense of security she hadn't felt since before Thomas's death. Here, hidden from the vast emptiness and the judgmental eyes of the world, she could almost breathe. The silence allowed her thoughts to settle. The raw terror was subsiding, replaced by a weary acknowledgement of her situation. She was still in peril, still reliant on the charity of a stranger from a people her own kind feared and reviled. Yet, in this unlikely refuge, she had found a momentary peace. Later, as dusk began to settle, Marwa returned as silently as he had left. He carried 2 rabbits, already skinned and cleaned, and a handful of roots. Without a word, he set about preparing the food, roasting the rabbits over the fire. The smell of cooking meat filled the small cave, a scent so welcome it made Ilara's mouth water. He offered her a share, a generous portion, and she ate with a hunger that surprised her. It was the first real meal she'd had in days, and it infused her with a strength she hadn't realized she'd lost. They ate in silence, the firelight flickering on their faces, casting long shadows on the cave walls. A fragile truce, an unspoken understanding, seemed to exist between them, born of shared solitude and the fundamental human need for sustenance and shelter. Days bled into a quiet routine, measured by the rising and setting of the sun and Marwa's comings and goings. He would leave at dawn, a silent shadow melting into the landscape, and return at dusk, usually with food, a rabbit, a prairie chicken, sometimes fish from a creek she hadn't known existed. He never spoke of where he went or what he did, and Ilara never asked. Words seemed superfluous, almost an intrusion in their Spartan existence. Her ankle, though still tender, began to heal under her careful ministrations. She spent her days in the relative safety of the cave or its immediate vicinity, gathering firewood from the sparse offerings of the drawer, tending the small fire, and mending her tattered clothes with the needle and thread from her bundle, one of the few practical items she possessed. She watched Marwa when he was near, studying his movements, his expressions, the way he interacted with the natural world. He was a man of immense patience and skill. He could sit motionless for hours, observing, listening. He wasted nothing. Every part of an animal was used, the meat for food, the hide for mending or making small pouches, even the bones were fashioned into tools or ornaments she sometimes saw him carving with a sharp flint knife. One morning, Ilara awoke with a burning fever and a racking cough. Her body ached, and a wave of nausea swept over her. Fear, sharp and cold, gripped her. Illness in this wilderness, with no medicine, no doctor, could be a death sentence, not just for her, but for her unborn child. Marwa, who had been preparing to leave, paused, his dark eyes studying her flushed face and labored breathing. He said nothing, but he did not leave. Instead, he went to the stream and returned with fresh water. He then rummaged through his pouch of herbs, selecting a few different kinds, crushing them between 2 stones and adding them to a small amount of heated water. He brought the steaming, pungent brew to her, gesturing for her to drink. Ilara hesitated. She knew nothing of his remedies. What if it was harmful? But looking into his steady, unblinking gaze, she saw not malice, but a quiet concern. And what choice did she have? She drank the bitter concoction, grimacing at the taste. He then soaked a piece of cloth in cool water and gently placed it on her forehead. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his large, calloused hands unexpectedly deft. For 2 days, the fever raged. Marwa stayed close, tending the fire, bringing her water and more of the herbal brew. He would sit quietly by the cave entrance, sometimes working on a piece of carving, sometimes simply watching the horizon. He did not fuss, nor did he offer empty words of comfort, but his constant, reassuring presence was a balm to her frayed nerves. During a lucid moment, when the fever had briefly subsided, she managed a weak, "Thank you." The words were barely a whisper. Marwa merely grunted in acknowledgement, his expression unchanging, but she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a softening of their usual impenetrable stoicism. When the fever finally broke, leaving her weak but clear-headed, a profound sense of gratitude filled her. He had saved her, she was certain of it. He had nursed her through the illness with a quiet, practical care that surpassed any she had expected. This act of kindness, unasked for and freely given, forged a new, deeper link in the fragile chain of trust between them. She began to feel a sense of safety, not just from the elements or wild animals, but from him. He was not her enemy. He was, in this desolate wilderness, her unlikely protector. She still knew almost nothing about him, his life, his people, his reasons for helping her. But his actions spoke louder than any words could. He had shared his shelter, his food, his medicine. He had treated her not as an outcast, not as a burden, but simply as another human being in need. This realization brought with it a quiet shame for the prejudices she herself had once held, born of ignorance and fear. Here, in this stark and unforgiving land, the arbitrary divisions of race and culture seemed to fade, leaving only the shared humanity of survival. As her strength slowly returned, Ilara felt a growing need to contribute, to lessen the burden of her presence. She could not hunt, nor did she possess Marwa's intimate knowledge of the edible plants that grew sparsely on the prairie. But she was not without skills. She had always been adept with a needle, a legacy from her mother. One evening, she noticed a long tear in the deerskin quiver Marwa used for his arrows. Without a word, she retrieved her small sewing kit, her precious needle, a few strands of sturdy thread. Holding up the quiver, she looked at him, a silent question. He watched her for a moment, then gave a curt nod of assent, pushing the quiver towards her. Her fingers, still a little clumsy from her illness, fumbled slightly as she threaded the needle. But soon, the familiar rhythm of stitching took over. She repaired the tear with small, neat stitches, reinforcing the worn leather as best she could. It was a small thing, yet it felt significant. It was her first tangible contribution to their shared existence. Marwa watched her work, his expression unreadable as always, but when she handed the mended quiver back to him, he examined her stitching with a careful eye, then grunted what she was beginning to recognize as a sound of approval. A faint warmth spread through her. It was a tiny victory, a small step towards regaining a sense of purpose, of self-worth. The baby within her moved, a strong, insistent kick, as if affirming her efforts. Ilara placed a hand on her belly, a soft smile touching her lips. This child was her anchor, her reason to fight, to endure. Every hardship, every small triumph, was for this new life. She would not let despair reclaim her. She had survived abandonment, illness, and the raw terror of the wilderness. A new resilience was taking root within her, nurtured by the unexpected sanctuary she had found and the quiet strength of the man who had offered it. She began to observe more closely the plants Marwa gathered, trying to learn which were edible, which medicinal. She started to take over the tasks of keeping the small campsite tidy, ensuring there was always wood for the fire, and water in their clay pot. These were small contributions, but they gave her a sense of participation, of not being entirely helpless. She would sometimes recall the faces of the wagon train elders, their harsh judgments, their pious pronouncements. The anger still simmered, a dull ache of injustice. But it no longer consumed her. Their world, with its rigid rules and narrow compassions, seemed distant now, almost unreal. Her world had shrunk to this small cave, this patch of prairie, this silent companionship. And in this constricted world, she was finding a different kind of freedom, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The environment remained a constant, often brutal, teacher. A sudden hailstorm would send them scrambling for the deepest recess of the cave, the ice stones battering the earth outside with violent force. A dry spell would make water scarce, forcing Marwa to travel further to find it. These challenges, shared in silence, forged a bond deeper than words. She learned to read the subtle shifts in the weather, the signs of animal presence, the language of the wind. The prairie, once a symbol of her abandonment and fear, was slowly becoming a familiar, if still formidable, landscape. She was no longer just Ilara, the outcast, the victim. She was Ilara, the survivor, the mother-to-be, a woman slowly, painstakingly, carving out a place for herself in a world that had tried to erase her. And beside her, a silent, watchful guardian, whose motives remained a mystery, but whose actions spoke of a profound, if unspoken, humanity. Autumn began to paint the prairie grasses in hues of rust and gold. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, carrying the first sharp bite of approaching winter. The wind, always a companion, now had a keener edge, a more insistent moan. Food became scarcer. The rabbits and prairie chickens were harder to find, their numbers thinned by the changing season and, Ilara suspected, by other hunters, though she never saw any. Marwa's excursions grew longer, his return sometimes yielding less than before. Worry gnawed at Ilara, not just for herself, but for him, and for the child growing steadily within her. One evening, Marwa returned late, long after dusk had fallen, his face grim. He carried nothing. It was the first time he had come back empty-handed. The silence in the small cave that night was heavier than usual, freighted with unspoken anxieties. The fire, usually a comforting presence, seemed to cast deeper, more menacing shadows. The next morning, before dawn, they were awakened by a sound that made Ilara's blood run cold, the low, guttural growl of a wolf, shockingly close. Then another, and another. A pack! Marwa was instantly alert, his hand reaching for his bow. He motioned for Ilara to stay deep within the cave, his eyes fixed on the entrance. The growls grew louder, accompanied by sniffing sounds just outside the rock overhang. Ilara's heart pounded against her ribs. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her hands protectively shielding her belly. She could hear the click of claws on rock, the heavy breathing of the animals. They were testing the defenses of the small shelter, drawn perhaps by the lingering scent of old fires, or by some other instinct she couldn't comprehend. Marwa stood poised at the cave mouth, a silent, formidable figure against the pale pre-dawn light. An arrow was narked, his body tense. One wolf, bolder than the rest, a large, dark shadow, poked its head under the overhang. Marwa loosed his arrow with a speed that blurred motion. A yelp of pain, a scuffling sound, and the shadow retreated. But the others remained, snarling, their hunger and aggression palpable in the chilled air. For what felt like an eternity, the standoff continued. Marwa did not waste another arrow. He simply stood his ground, a bulwark between her and the predators. Ilara, watching him, felt a surge of admiration mingled with her fear. He was courage personified, a man seamlessly part of this wild, dangerous world, yet capable of such staunch protection. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the sounds began to recede. The growls faded into the distance, the tension slowly ebbing from the air. Marwa remained vigilant for a long while, listening, before finally lowering his bow. He retrieved his arrow from just outside the cave, it was blooded. He said nothing, but his expression was stern. The encounter had shaken Ilara deeply. It was a stark reminder of their vulnerability, of the constant, lurking dangers of the wilderness. But it also reinforced her dependence on Marwa, and the depth of his protective instincts. Later that day, as if to underscore the precariousness of their existence, a fierce, unseasonable blizzard swept down from the north. The wind howled like a banshee, driving sheets of blinding snow before it. The temperature plummeted. They retreated into the deepest part of the cave, Marwa building up the fire, using their carefully hoarded wood. The small space became their entire world, the storm raging outside a monstrous, unseen force. They huddled close to the flames, the shared need for warmth overriding any lingering awkwardness of proximity. Ilara found herself mending a tear in Marwa's deerskin shirt, her fingers working nimbly despite the cold. He, in turn, showed her how to effectively bank the fire to conserve fuel, a small lesson conveyed through gestures and patient demonstration. In the enforced intimacy of the stormbound cave, a new level of quiet understanding seemed to develop. The shared danger, the shared effort to survive, stripped away another layer of reserve. They were two solitary beings, pitted against the immense power of nature, their survival inextricably linked. When the blizzard finally subsided after 2 long days, it left behind a world transformed, a pristine, silent landscape draped in a thick blanket of white. The beauty was breathtaking, but also menacing. The snow would make hunting even more difficult, travel treacherous. Their meager supplies were dangerously low. Yet, as Ilara looked at Marwa, his face calm and resolute as he surveyed the snow-covered prairie, she felt not despair, but a quiet determination mirroring his own. They had weathered the storm, the wolves, the hunger. They would face what came next, together. The pristine snow, beautiful as it was, soon became a cruel adversary. It covered the familiar landmarks, hid the snares Marwa set, and made tracking game nearly impossible. Their meager store of dried roots and the last of the smoked meat dwindled alarmingly. The hunger pains, once a dull ache for Ilara, became a constant, gnawing presence. She saw the strain on Marwa's face, though he never complained. He pushed himself harder, staying out longer in the freezing cold, returning with less and less, sometimes with nothing but a grim shake of his head. Ilara tried to help, venturing out to gather what dry grasses and twigs the wind exposed, anything that might burn, but her movements were increasingly hampered by the advanced stage of her pregnancy and the treacherous, icy ground. One afternoon, while Marwa was away on a desperate hunt, Ilara was gathering firewood near the edge of the draw when she heard voices. Not Marwa's guttural tones, but English. Her heart leaped, then sank with a cold dread. Peering cautiously through a screen of snow-dusted willows, she saw them, 3 men on horseback, bundled against the cold, their faces hard and unfamiliar. They were not from her wagon train, she was sure of it. Trappers, perhaps, or worse, men who roamed the frontier taking what they wanted. They were close, too close, and seemed to be heading directly for the draw, perhaps seeking shelter or drawn by the thin wisp of smoke from their carefully tended fire, which she had failed to completely extinguish. Panic seized her. If they found her, alone and vulnerable. She scrambled back towards the cave, her mind racing. She had to warn Marwa, but he was gone. She had to hide, to protect herself and her unborn child. She doused the fire quickly, scattering the ashes, hoping to erase any sign of their habitation. She retreated deep into the cave, pressing herself into the darkest corner, praying they would pass by. The sound of their voices grew louder, rough laughter, curt commands. Then, silence. A tense, waiting silence. Footsteps crunched on the snow outside the cave entrance. Ilara held her breath, her body rigid with terror. A shadow fell across the opening. "Well, now. What have we here?" a gruff voice drawled. A man stooped to enter, his silhouette framed against the grey light. He was burly, with a grizzled beard and small, assessing eyes. 2 more followed him in, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and menace. They saw her, huddled in the corner. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across the first man's face. "Looks like we found ourselves a little lost lamb. All alone out here, RYA, sweetheart." Ilara said nothing, her mind a whirl of fear. She could smell the stale scent of unwashed bodies and whiskey on them. "Got anything to eat in this little hole?" the second man asked, his gaze avariciously scanning the meager contents of the cave. "Or anything else of value?" The first man took a step closer. "Where's your man, eh? Or did he run off and leave YA?" Ilara's silence seemed to amuse them. Just as the man reached out a grimy hand towards her, a shadow fell across the cave entrance again, larger this time, more formidable. Marwa. He stood there, bow in hand, an arrow narked, his face a mask of cold fury. He had returned, silently, like a spirit of the frozen land. The 3 men whirled around, startled. Their bravado faltered at the sight of the armed Shawnee hunter, his eyes blazing with a dangerous light. "Well, looky here," the leader stammered, trying to regain his composure, his hand inching towards the pistol tucked in his belt. "Just an Injun. What's he to why, girl?" Marwa spoke, not in English, but in his own tongue, a low, guttural snarl that needed no translation. It was a warning, a challenge. He took a step into the cave, placing himself between Ilara and the intruders. The tension was electric, the air thick with impending violence. The leader's hand tightened on his pistol. "Now, hold on, Redskin. We ain't looking for trouble," but his eyes betrayed his lie. Marwa did not wait. He moved with lightning speed. Before the man could draw his weapon, Marwa's bowstring twanged. The arrow struck the trapper's pistol hand with a sickening thud. The man roared in pain, his gun clattering to the cave floor. The other two, momentarily stunned, lunged forward. Marwa dropped his bow and drew the long knife from his belt, meeting their rush with a deadly grace. Ilara watched in horrified fascination. It was brutal, swift, and terrifyingly efficient. Marwa was a whirlwind of motion, his knife flashing. There were grunts, cries of pain, the sickening sound of impact. And then, silence, broken only by labored breathing. Two of the men lay still. The leader, clutching his bleeding hand, scrambled backwards out of the cave, terror etched on his face. He stumbled away into the snow, disappearing as quickly as he had come. Marwa stood, breathing heavily, his knife still in hand, his chest rising and falling. He turned to Ilara, his dark eyes searching hers, a question in their depths. She could only stare back, shaken to her core, but filled with an overwhelming sense of awe and gratitude. He had saved her, again. He had faced down armed men, defended her with a ferocity that was both terrifying and profoundly reassuring. In that moment, the last vestiges of her fear of him, of his world, vanished. He was her protector, her fierce, silent champion. The aftermath of the confrontation hung heavy in the frigid air of the small cave. The bodies of the two fallen intruders lay where they had fallen, stark reminders of the brutal reality of survival in this untamed land. Marwa, his breathing slowly returning to normal, methodically retrieved his arrow and cleaned his knife on a handful of snow, his movements economical and devoid of any triumph or remorse. It was a grim necessity, a task completed. Ilara, still trembling, rose slowly from her corner. The adrenaline that had coursed through her veins was ebbing, leaving her weak-kneed and nauseous. She looked at Marwa, her protector, her silent savior. Words failed her. What could she possibly say to convey the depth of her gratitude, the complex swirl of emotions that churned within her? He met her gaze, his own dark eyes holding a quiet intensity. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, a profound, unspoken understanding passing between them. In that shared glance, born of terror and relief, of violence and deliverance, a bond was forged, stronger than any words, deeper than any cultural divide. He had risked his life for her, for the unborn child she carried. This truth settled into her heart with an undeniable weight. He then turned his attention to the grim task at hand, dragging the bodies out of the cave and into the snow-covered draw, some distance away. Ilara watched him, a sense of profound respect washing over her. He was not just a hunter, a survivor, he was a man of honor, in his own way, bound by code she was only beginning to comprehend. When he returned, he did not speak of what had happened. He simply rekindled the fire, the familiar ritual, a comforting anchor in the turbulent sea of their recent experience. The silence that followed was different from their earlier silences. It was no longer born of caution or unfamiliarity, but of shared trauma and a nascent, powerful connection. Ilara knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within her soul, that she was no longer alone. Her transformation, gradual and hard one, felt complete. The frightened, abandoned woman who had been cast out onto the prairie was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had faced death and despair and had not broken. She had found an inner resilience she hadn't known she possessed, and it had been nurtured by the unlikeliest of saviors. Later that evening, as the meager fire cast dancing shadows on the cave walls, a sharp, insistent pain shot through Ilara's lower back, radiating around to her belly. She gasped, clutching her abdomen. Another pain followed, stronger this time. The baby. It was time. Panic, a familiar foe, tried to claw its way back, but she pushed it down. She looked at Marwa, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, new calm. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something akin to concern, perhaps even gentleness, in his usually stoic expression. He understood. He rose and added more wood to the fire, then spread his own thickest fur pelt on the driest part of the cave floor. He brought her water. His actions were practical, reassuring. He said nothing, but his presence was a solid, unwavering support. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and effort, of primal struggle. Marwa stayed with her, a silent, watchful presence in the dim light. He wiped her brow with a cool, damp cloth when the waves of pain crested. He offered her water. His quiet strength seemed to flow into her, giving her courage. And then, in the deep, still heart of the frozen night, with the wind whispering secrets outside the cave, her child was born. A lusty cry pierced the silence, a sound of vibrant, tenacious life. A daughter. Ilara, exhausted but elated, held the tiny, squirming infant to her breast. Tears streamed down her face, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming love. Marwa, who had stepped back respectfully during the final moments, approached slowly. He looked at the baby, a long, considering look. Then, he reached out a calloused finger and gently touched the infant's soft cheek. A rare, almost imperceptible softening touched the corners of his mouth. In that moment, in the shared miracle of new life, they were no longer just a settler woman and a Shawnee hunter. They were two souls bound by hardship, by survival, and now, by the fragile, precious gift of a new beginning. The world outside the small cave remained a landscape of stark, frozen beauty, but within, a new warmth had blossomed, centered around the tiny, sleeping form of Ilara's daughter. She named her hope, a quiet acknowledgement of the fragile emotion that had sustained her through the darkest of times, an emotion now given tangible form. The days found a new rhythm, dictated by the baby's needs. Marwa, with an unexpected gentleness, proved to be an invaluable help. He fashioned a soft sling from a piece of doeskin so Ilara could keep Hope close while her hands were free. He brought her nourishing broths made from the scarce game he managed to find, his hunting skills seemingly sharpened by a new urgency. He would sit for long periods, watching the infant with a quiet fascination, his stern features sometimes relaxing into an expression of profound contemplation. The brutal encounter with the trappers seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by the immediacy of caring for a newborn in the harsh wilderness. Yet, it had irrevocably changed the dynamic between them. The last vestiges of Ilara's apprehension about Marwa had been replaced by a deep, abiding trust and a quiet affection that transcended words or cultural understanding. She saw him not as an Indian, a representative of a feared and misunderstood people, but as Marwa, the individual, a man of courage, resilience, and surprising tenderness. She often reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. Cast out by her own kind, left to perish, she had been saved by someone her society deemed a savage. The irony was not lost on her. She had learned more about true compassion and human decency from this silent Shawnee hunter than she had from many of the pious folk of the wagon train. The vast, indifferent prairie, once a symbol of her desolation, no longer felt so threatening. It was their home, harsh and demanding, but also a place of unexpected sanctuary, a crucible that had forged her strength. The silence between them remained, but it was a comfortable, companionable silence now, filled with unspoken understanding. Occasionally, Marwa would speak a few words in his own tongue, pointing to an object, naming it for her, or for the baby. Ilara, in turn, would sometimes speak to Hope in English, her voice soft, knowing Marwa listened. It was a slow, hesitant bridging of worlds, a communication built on shared experience rather than common language. Her transformation was profound. The fear that had once been her constant companion had receded, replaced by a quiet confidence in her ability to endure, to protect her child. She was a mother, a survivor. She had found a strength within herself she never knew existed, a resilience tempered in the fires of adversity. The future remained uncertain. The winter was long, and survival a daily challenge. But she no longer faced it alone. She had Marwa, her unlikely ally, her steadfast protector. And she had hope, a tiny beacon illuminating the path ahead. As she looked at her daughter, nestled warm and safe in her arms, and then at Marwa, his stoic profile outlined by the flickering firelight, a sense of peace settled over Ilara, a peace she had thought lost to her forever. Here, in this wild, untamed land, with these two souls by her side, she had found not just survival, but a new, unexpected kind of family, a new, resilient kind of life. The wind might still howl outside their small haven, and the prairie might still hold its dangers, but within the small circle of their shared existence, there was warmth, there was strength, and there was, undeniably, hope.